I listen to a commercial about sugary breakfast cereals, I know that they're not good for me. And most people know that also. But when it comes to a drug, when we go to a doctor, most people feel pretty good that that doctor went to 4 years of undergrad, he had a very high grade, so he went to med school. He's a very smart guy, he's honest, we like doctors. The doctors are giving us drugs based on the clinical trials. So everything a doctor tells us, who we trust, is completely based on the results of a clinical trial. So as long as the clinical trials are mostly accurate, then we're okay. But are you saying, so the question is, should the public assume that drug trial results are accurate, unbiased, and reliable, or should we say they're not? Because if you're saying that we shouldn't assume they're accurate, then how could we assume anything the doctor tells us, even if he has the best intentions, is accurate if he's reporting on drug trials that we're saying were not accurate?
Let me defend doctors for a second. And when we've studied this, and frankly, I have been involved in studies where we've looked at the influence of the pharmaceutical companies on physician education, okay? So we're talking about doctors that see pharmaceutical reps in their offices, have lunches brought to them, go to conferences sponsored by, oftentimes it'll be a colleague doctor who is paid by the pharmaceutical company to come and speak about the newest antidepressant or the latest antipsychotic. So you think, well, he's a good guy, you know, he just practices down the street. Knowing that he may be getting several $1,000s for a 1-hour talk to convince his colleagues of the benefits of this treatment, the single most, I think, important factor in determining whether your doctor is getting good information about, really about disease and about treatments is the degree to which they have contact with the pharmaceutical industry. And this is, again, not just my speaking. This has been studied over years and years. In fact, I'll tell you one study that blew my mind, and this was a study called There's No Free Lunch. And they took a group of doctors, there were several hundred doctors, and some of them, so they randomized them, some of them were sent to a Caribbean island to attend a 2 or 3 day symposium or conference on this new drug. And the other doctors were, you know, stayed in their practices in New England and so on. And then they and of course, beforehand, the doctors were surveyed. Do you think that attending this conference is going to influence your prescribing of this company's drugs? Absolutely not. I can't be bought. I'm a professional. Okay, good. So let's study this. And then they followed the prescribing of those doctors who went to the Caribbean vacation versus those who didn't, and they found some very surprising things. The prescribing of this drug, which was, I think it was a kind of a marginal antibiotic, was not only 2 or 3 times, it was like 20 times higher than it was for the physicians who stayed at home. Even though it cost the country thousands of dollars to send all those doctors to this island, it paid off in sales and prescribing down the road. So, you know, I would say that, you know, there's a lot of problems in medicine, but when it comes to drug information, I think the single biggest problem is the conflicts of interest in the education of our doctors. Do doctors learn about nutrition? Do they learn about alternative treatments to drugs? No, because you don't have very expensive, very slick and very convincing reps going to their offices and telling them why patients should be, you know, taking a plant-based diet, for example, if they've got diabetes and so on. So, you know, we're skewing the education of physicians by allowing this contact and this influence by the drug companies. And, you know, again, it's not just me speaking. This is well documented in my book and other books, and it is a clear example of something we really don't want medicine. Because at the end of the day, when you go to your doctor, you want her to make a decision based on you, your preferences, and the best evidence, the systematic reviewed evidence, not what the drug rep dropped off at their office last week.
Just to add, so pharma money helps helps medical conferences to be held in nice, glamorous surroundings. Maybe not always in the Caribbean, but, you know, in a nice hotel in London or New York or wherever. And that, of course, helps doctors to feel important and and valued. But I do think things are changing to some extent. The British Medical Journal has had a big campaign against pharmaceutical industry influence. And a few years ago, there was a president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK who banned any pharma funding from any pharma sponsorship from the annual conference. And the annual conference was therefore held in a very scruffy student university in completely different surroundings than usual. They've sadly haven't stuck with that and have gone back to the posh hotels, but it showed that it could be done. It was perfectly well attended, it just wasn't as glamorous as usual.
Just let me go further with that question. Just the nature of a drug trial. In other words, if all medicine today has to have a drug trial to be approved, Ben Goldacre, who's a writer, wrote a book called Bad Pharma. And in this book, which he said something to the effect that you can do lots of studies and only report on the ones that you want. Now, maybe I misinterpreted it, but the way I heard that was that you could do 20 studies and report on the 3 that came out good and not on the other 17. So again, everyone is using medicine, and everyone is using it based on that a drug trial was done that said, 1, it's effective, and 2, it's not dangerous. So are drug trials, are they allowed to influence, is whoever does the drug trial able to make it come out better than it is? Is it possible that when we go to a pharmacy and we get a drug that we think is safe, that the doctor thinks is safe, it actually was never tested correctly that the drug trial process was not really a fair trial, and so if they really did 20 trials and 3 came out good and 17 came out bad and they buried the 17, that would be very misleading. So again, the question is, should we assume that drug clinical trials are accurate, or should we assume that they're not accurate? How should we think about this?
I think the way we should think about it is that we need to ask more questions. And Ben Goldacre, by the way, is behind this All Trials organization that I've mentioned that is really at the forefront of getting companies to register their trials. The problem, and maybe it's not a problem, but one of the situations happens that they test drugs in certain types of people. For example, a drug for osteoporosis will be tested in women who have been defined as having low bone density based on a certain definition, 2.5 standard deviations below a mean of the bone density of a 35-year-old woman, for example. So, and that woman who has this low bone density has been diagnosed with a DEXA scan and have determined that they've got osteoporosis. The drug might be indicated for that person. Well, what about other people? So when I say indicated, this is a really important word. A drug gets an indication, which means that it has been indicated tested in that type of patient. But what if you don't have that low of bone density? Or what if you have normal bone density, but you're just worried? Will the doctor prescribe the drug? The question as a patient you have to ask is, well, what is the drug indicated for? Is it indicated for someone who has low or very mildly normal low bone density? So this is a question that you need to ask whenever someone is coming at you with a prescription pad, is what is the drug indicated for? Because sometimes when they test the drug and it gets approved for some indication, it gets not approved for other indications, which is to say antidepressants. Some antidepressants, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, are indicated for adults who have this level of depressive symptoms or so on, but not indicated for children, which is to say the drug has not proven itself in children. But what happens when the drug gets approved, gets on the market, and then everyone starts prescribing it? Well, guess what? Doctors they're not held bound by the indication. They can prescribe it to whoever they want, who they think it might help, which might be a good thing in some cases, but sometimes the doctor doesn't know that the drug is contraindicated in other populations, which means that you shouldn't be giving it to those patients. Maybe in one case it might be children or pregnant women. And so knowing the indication of a drug is a really important piece of information. And that is often obscured. That will be proven by the clinical trial, which, as we indicate, might have some problems, but at least when you ask when you're being prescribed a drug, knowing what it is actually been tested in is a very important piece of information.
And another thing that you have to realize is that, like the bone density, you'll never see a drug tested against exercise, okay, or diet. You'll never see a chemo agent tested against placebo, because the placebo would win every time. You'll only see a chemo agent tested against another chemo agent. So it's not set up for health or for your welfare. It's set up to sell a drug. Follow the money. Bill Clinton taught us that.
And when you think of some things that have wonderful nutrition-based solutions, let's say type 2 diabetes. So you've got high blood sugars. We know that there's been solid research on plant-based diets and just altering your diet, reducing carbohydrates and so on.
Exercise.
And exercise does wonderful. People throw their drugs away. They get rid of the insulin because they went from being a diabetic to being a non-diabetic without any drugs. And so the question is, how often does that information get conveyed in a clinical encounter with a physician? And, frankly, the education around nutrition in medical school, I think, is still really lacking.